Discovering Alaska with President Harding. The Inside Story of an Epic-Making Trip to Wonderland. By Joe Mitchell Chappell. McClure's Magazine, October 1923. Only 4 more speeches to write, now for a glorious holiday. There was a radiant, carefree smile on the face of President Warren G. Harding as he ascended the gangway of the historic transport Henderson, destined to carry to the yet mysterious shores of Alaska the first president of the United States who ever visited our northern wonderland. Ever since his trip to Panama in 1920, President Harding has dreamed of a voyage of discovery to the farthest flung frontiers of the Republic. Emblem of his dream come true, the president's blue 4-starred flag with the Great Seal of the United States emblazoned upon it was flying at the Henderson's masthead. The grim gray sides of this naval transport, the largest ship that ever sailed Alaskan waters, reminded us of her heroic service in the war zone when she carried soldiers of the AEF to France. She was one of the first to take our troops overseas, and once, in flames, she was abandoned at sea. Now, for a few weeks, the Henderson was to be virtually the White House afloat. And from the start, there were those of us aboard who recalled the wartime misadventure and felt her a ship of ill omen. Yet profound was the thrill we felt in thus setting forth on a voyage of 20th century exploration, to discover the Alaska of today through the eyes of the nation's chief executive. The trip was to mark an epoch, to bring about an awakening of the people of the United States to the scenic beauties and inspiring future of this subarctic empire of ours that has been for years exploited, neglected, misrepresented, or veiled in a glamour of romantic unreality hanging over from gold rush days and perpetuated in the films and best-selling thrillers. In the soft rain of that July afternoon, throngs gathered on the great community wharf at Tacoma to cheer and wave farewell. There were misty eyes among them. It is hard to conceive just what it would have meant to those assembled had they known that this indeed was their last farewell to their president. The leave-taking was very simple. Hands were waved and the Henderson backed out. In a few moments, she was plying her way down Puget Sound as the roar of 21 guns, the presidential salute, resounded from shore to shore. 2 destroyers, steaming slowly, convoyed us fore and aft, like watchdogs held in leash. "Where is the president's stateroom?" somebody inquired. Attention turned to the large cabin aft on the upper deck. Screens enclosed the deck to combat the Alaskan mosquito, of whose viciousness we had heard much. Along the upper promenade, the bower of flowers literally formed an avenue of blossoms of every hue and color. The Navy band on board began their afternoon concert. "Yes, We Have No Bananas" pushed its way into the program. "Iowa, Iowa, That's Where the Tall Corn Grows" was the concluding number. Over and over it was repeated, until Secretary Wallace, the gentleman from Iowa, was accused of having bribed the bandmaster. With his new seagoing cap properly adjusted to protect the dome, as he said, Speaker Gillette sidled down the rail to settle a point of order. "Shall I wear high or low shoes on deck in daylight?" he queried anxiously. Acquaintances ripened quickly. Formalities were thrown overboard. The president held informal open-air cabinet meetings by the rail amidships, where the cabinet trio, Secretaries Work, Hoover, and Wallace, foregathered. Secretary Hoover later snuggled into a big chair on deck behind a huge cigar, and was soon absorbed in data about Alaska fisheries, his own particular province. Typewriters began to click in the staterooms. The newspaper artillery was beginning to throw up a barrage, and to open rapid fire with the slightest bits of deck gossip as munitions. Secretary Hubert Work kept his assistant Donald busy furnishing Interior Department data. Dr. Work was the government railroad magnate, in charge of 500 miles of Alaskan railway, to say nothing of 16 other bureaus. Colonel Greeley, chief of the Forest Bureau, discussed the overripe forests with Secretary Wallace. "There are over 200 million acres of national forest reserves in Alaska, a wooded wonderland, unparalleled," said Colonel Greeley, and he added, "Many water power sources are located conveniently for paper mill projects." Thus early were we introduced to Alaska and her true role, a great national storehouse, holding vast, untouched reservoirs of natural wealth, with timber, fish, fur, and precious metals as the big four among her manifold products. 5 cabinet officers and 28 bureaus exercise authority in Alaska, and Alaska still lives. The local government is represented by 4 judicial districts, electing to the legislature in Juneau 4 senators and 16 representatives. The U.S. Judge, U.S. Marshal, and U.S. Attorney are Uncle Sam's local triumvirate, with Governor Scott Bone at the head. The great problem discussed by officials on board was how to coordinate and consolidate under some one central authority the now weirdly subdivided administration of the territory. The scarcity of authentic books and accurate descriptive literature on the Alaska of today was revealed when we began to borrow each other's books. The romantic novels and adventure stories deal with a fictional side of Alaska which has passed, as has our own Wild West. And herein lies the vital importance of President Harding's Alaskan trip. As the president laid aside the book he was reading on deck one day, he remarked, "What we want, boys, is to understand the actual situation in Alaska now. Keep your eyes and ears open, get acquainted with the people, and tell the folks back home what the real Alaska of today is like." Official information was available, but the popular books read on this voyage were those of Jack London and Rex Beach. Some indulged in Robert Service's poems and in John Muir's classic. The book which was borrowed most of all was my copy of Frank Carpenter's Alaska. One copy of Bancroft's history was found, and one of Vitus Bering's log, revealing the romance of the days of early explorers. The discoverer of Alaska, Vitus Bering, was Danish-born. He is said to have been buried on some unknown island in the Pacific. Under the dying command of Peter the Great, he set sail to discover the Northwest Passage in 1741. With such other names as those of Captain Cook of England, Baranov of Russia, Fidalgo of Spain, Malaspina of France, Captain Cox of Sweden, Vauxhall of Holland, and Captain Cleveland of the USA, all associated with early discoveries there, Alaska's history is a composite of explorers' dreams such as no other spot on Earth can claim. This explains the cosmopolitan character of the names now found on the map of Alaska. Sailing nearly 1,000 miles to the northward, as far as from New York to Chicago, through British waters, the stately Henderson cast her shadows on both shores of the longest inland saltwater river sea on Earth. That famous inland passage was like a myriad of Hudsons and St. Lawrences rolled into one. From each deserted, silent coast of the narrow channel rose numberless mountains. Snow-capped Rockies on the right, and the heavily timbered primeval forests of fir on the islands to the left. It was a scene of the 1,000 islands, multiplied in endless, almost monotonous panorama day by day. Only a little inlet fishing village or a lumber camp marked human habitation, and these were hundreds of miles apart. Thus, the days on shipboard lengthened into vistas of scenic splendor, with only the eddying tides to ruffle the serenity of our pilot as he sought a way to swing the big vessel around the sharp bends. The icy waters of these deep channels could tell many weird tales of wrecks on the reefs or in blinding fog and sleet. It was here that the Princess Sophia was lost in 1917, with 200 souls. Late on the 4th evening, we came out to view our first Alaskan sunset. It was nearly 10 o'clock. Alaskan waters had been reached at last, and we were to anchor, provided we could find bottom. The sailor heaving the lead shouted, "20 fathoms and no bottom." But a few feet farther on, anchorage was secured. The President and Mrs. Harding joined us on deck. The sun appeared to be rent asunder by fleecy white clouds, circling like an upturned bowl of fire with a tiny rim at the top. The reflection shimmered on the water. The face of the sun was encircled with a glowing border of deep purple. Looking upon that fiery picture, painted in celestial colors, the president murmured, "Wonderful." It was the word he used again and again on the trip to express emotions awakened by the scenic splendor of a land where every superlative seems weak. The tide swung the bow of the ship to the west. The silence of our sunset worship was broken by Mrs. Harding's favorite refrain, "The end of a perfect day." Two figures stood side by side, silhouetted on the upper deck against the gold and purple blaze. They were the President and the First Lady of the land, gazing through the portals of the twilight upon their first vista of Alaskan shores. Next day, we were awakened by the shrill whistle of a tugboat on which an Indian band was playing the Star-Spangled Banner as the reception committee from the town of Metlakatla came out to meet us. In the glory of this sunny Sunday morning, the presidential party was met by Governor Scott Bone. The landing was made in launches, and here, for the first time in history, a president of the United States set foot on the soil of Alaska. The little village of Metlakatla, of some 500 native-born Alaskan Indians, nestled in a verdure of grass and foliage. It was the community town of the island of Annette, about the size of Staten Island, given by a special act of Congress to these Indians through the influence of Henry Ward Beecher and Phillips Brooks to provide a haven for Father Duncan and his Tsimshian Indian converts. The twin Westminster-like towers of Father Duncan's church on the hill, the largest edifice devoted to religious worship in Alaska, loomed up, a landmark of missionary achievement. 100 houses, some of them deserted, told the story of former days. On the wharf, the party was met by a throng of little Indian children who led the way to the schoolhouse, under an arch on which they had inscribed, "God bless our President." An assembly comprising almost every living person on the island of Annette gathered to greet the president on the schoolhouse lawn. A choir sang the Hallelujah chorus from the Messiah, and an open forum followed, in which the members of the cabinet participated. The board sidewalks of the town of Metlakatla were raised on stilts, high above the mossy ground and the luxuriant undergrowth, which was almost of a tropical nature. Skunk cabbages and larkspur, bleeding hearts and fireweed all grew in wild profusion. Daisies starred the grass everywhere. Gardens of potatoes were in blossom. Peas and lettuce and other vegetables were to be found in abundance. Prepared though we had been, we were amazed at the fertility of Alaska's soil, where vegetation works overtime in an almost everlasting summer day. Here there are heavy rainfalls and hot sunshine to work miracles in gardening. Just before leaving Metlakatla, the president raised the Stars and Stripes on the flagpole. He was repeating the ceremony of 1867 at Sitka, when Alaska became American soil. On the wharf, a huge king salmon, 4 feet long, gaily decorated, was presented to President Harding, representing the most important of Alaska's industries. The president smiled knowingly as he turned to Secretary Hoover, whose brow was already wrinkled with contemplation of fishery problems. Alaska covers an area equal to that of all the Empire States of the Mississippi Valley. 1/5 of the land of the United States represents the territory lying within the boundaries of Alaska. The sum of $7,200,000 with which it was purchased 56 years ago has already yielded over $1.25 billion in products. Every year, the original cost of Alaska has been taken from its waters and its soil. And strange though it may seem, not gold but the fisheries today make up more of this total than all the other products combined. All this from a territory with a population in 1920 of 55,000, one half white with 25,000 Indians and Eskimos and 500 Chinese and Japanese. There are more people in any one of the cities of Kalamazoo, Kankakee, Kenosha, and almost as many in Oshkosh as in Alaska's entire area of 378 million acres. We looked in vain for crowds. It was no wonder there were no great throngs, for there are as many people working in the Equitable Building in New York as there are white people in all Alaska. And yet these few individuals represent a productive power of astonishing figures, aggregating millions of dollars annually. Crossing the inlet channel amid myriads of uninhabited, forest-covered islands, we landed a few hours later at Ketchikan, the first port of call in Alaska. It is located above the Portland Canal, close to the Canadian border. Ketchikan was a busy port in Klondike days, when the city was like one great wharf, roosting high on green, sea-stained pilings, surrounded by mountains rising almost from the water's edge. You could feel in the throng that welcomed us with songs and cheers the spirit of American enterprise. The houses built far up on the side of the mountains were all decorated with pictures and flags, and the reception committee wore silk hats, prepared for a dignified welcome. Then every head was bared and former servicemen held their snappy salute as the president stood at attention before leaving the ship while the band played the national anthem. The Ketchikan band on the narrow street responded. In automobiles, systematically numbered, the party was taken to the canyon to view the new baseball park and the waterworks channel. The red-painted canneries representing the largest industry in Ketchikan were inspected. On the tide flats 30 feet below the pile-supported wooden streets and sidewalks, a game of baseball was in progress on the sandy beach. Hitherto, the games had been played there, tide permitting, but the sea's tendency to rush in and interrupt proceedings had compelled the building of the new ballpark up the canyon. Here were people from every state in the Union. Ketchikan is a cosmopolitan seaport. Nestling on the side of the towering mountains, it was like a picturesque glimpse of Norway. "Now for business," the president said as he led a committee of residents to the upper deck of the Henderson for a conference. The boat was held an hour while the conference continued. In the meantime, someone discovered it was the anniversary of the wedding of President and Mrs. Harding. There was a rush to offer congratulations and good wishes. Mrs. Harding held the crowd at bay with cordial conversation, while, in cabinet fashion, the president exchanged ideas with the citizens of Ketchikan as to what was needed to protect the fishing industries, to establish more direct market and cable communication with the United States, and to build up the pulpwood and paper industry which had already been started near there in connection with the sawmill and water power development. Soon thereafter, we were steaming northward again amid the witcheries of Alaskan moonlight, up the inland sea, bound for Wrangell. In the morning, boat crews from the destroyers were met by quaint war vessels of another and more ancient kind, the war canoes of the Indians painted in gay, barbaric designs, and manned by natives in equally colorful war blankets. Wrangell is one of the oldest names in the history of Alaska. The town that bears it is over 1,000 miles distant from Mount Wrangell and the island of Wrangell. Like Ketchikan, it is built on the side of the mountain, with business buildings and streets planted on tall green stilts above the muddy waters of the Stikine River. The president did not retire early that night, and I shall never forget his comments. "You know, I do enjoy meeting these people," he said. "They help me more than I can tell them. They have preserved the sturdy spirit of the pioneer, and without our pioneers and frontiers, we are likely to lose the self-reliance and understanding courage which has made our nation grow." In a remarkably short time, President Harding has gained a real understanding of and admiration for the people of Alaska. "Can you conceive of anything finer than you see here?" he continued meditatively as he puffed his pipe. "Where men rear robust, educated families with the right ideals and make happy homes, where they go ahead and do things without fear or favor. Alaska is going to work out her own problems if I judge these people aright. For, first of all, they have that great heritage of health which means so much." He sighed as he said these words, and his voice was that of a tired man.